dawn of victory over fascism, thousands of Russian soldiers, dressed in foreign uniforms, retreated westward, fleeing their own homeland. They were led by the former hero of the defense of Moscow, who had become a symbol of betrayal. Who was he? A coward, an idealist, or a hostage of his time? Today, we will once again open the pages of a forgotten war and ask, can a traitor be a patriot, and a patriot a traitor? Subscribe to the channel to explore the most controversial mysteries of history together, and write in the EE comments whether General Vlasov had a real alternative to his fateful choice. In September 1914, a boy was born into a peasant family in the village of Lomakino, in the Nizhny Novgorod province. He was destined to become one of the most controversial figures in 20th century Russian history. Andrei Andreevich Vlasov was born into a family where his father worked as a tailor, and his mother took care of the household and raised 13 children. The future general's childhood was spent in a typical peasant environment of that time. The family lived modestly but was not poor. His father, Andrei Ivanovich, was distinguished by his hard work and desire to give his children an education, which was rare in their social environment. His mother, Anna Ivanovna, instilled in her son the basics of the Orthodox faith and folk morality. Even at an early age, Andrei showed extraordinary abilities. He learned easily, quickly grasped new things, and had an excellent memory. At the age of 13, the boy entered the Nizhny Novgorod Theological Seminary, which was made possible thanks to the help of a local priest who noticed the abilities of the peasant's son. His seminary years shaped the character of the future military leader. There he received a classical education, studying Latin, Greek, philosophy, and history. Teachers noted his analytical mind and ability to think deeply. However, the revolutionary events of 1917 radically changed the young seminarian's life plans. After the February Revolution, Vlasov, like many of his peers, found himself at a historical crossroads. The old world was collapsing, and the new one had not yet taken shape. At this time, the 18-year-old young man made a decision that determined his entire future fate. He enlisted in the Red Army. The Civil War became a real school of life for Vlasov. He began his service as a simple Red Army soldier, but quickly demonstrated his organizational skills and military talent. Commanders noticed his ability to analyze situations, make quick decisions, and lead people. In 1920, the 26-year-old Vlasov was already commanding a regiment. He participated in battles against Wrangel's troops in Crimea and distinguished himself during the storming of Perekop. For his bravery and skillful command, he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. After the end of the Civil War, the young commander remained in the army. He understood that military service was his calling. In peacetime, he continued his education, graduated from the military academy, and constantly improved his qualifications. His colleagues described him as an exceptionally capable officer with brilliant prospects. Thus began the journey of a peasant's son who, 20 years later, would become one of the most famous generals of the Red Army, and a few years later, the most despised traitor in Soviet history. The 1930s were a time of rapid advancement in Vlasov's military career. Amid widespread repression, when Stalin was destroying the old Red Army command, young officers were given unique opportunities for promotion. Vlasov not only managed to avoid repression, but also significantly strengthened his position in the military hierarchy. In 1928, he was appointed commander of a rifle regiment. His colleagues noted his exceptional organizational skills and ability to work with personnel. Vlasov demanded high discipline from his subordinates, but at the same time cared about their living conditions and morale. The commander's talent was particularly evident during the conflict on the Chinese Eastern Railway in 1929. Vlasov commanded one of the units fighting against the Chinese troops. His unit distinguished itself in several operations, for which the commander received thanks from his superiors. In the early 1930s, Vlasov entered the Frunze Military Academy. Studying came easily to him. He was always among the best students in his class. Teachers highly valued his analytical abilities, strategic thinking, and deep knowledge of military history. After graduating from the academy in 1937, Vlasov was assigned to the Kiev Military District. There he commanded a rifle regiment, then a division. During this time, he was noticed by the district commander Ivan Tyulenev, who became the young general's patron. The repressions of 1937 to 1938 paradoxically contributed to Vlasov's career. Many experienced commanders were arrested and shot, freeing up positions for new personnel. Vlasov managed not only to survive, but also to demonstrate his loyalty to the regime. In 1938, he was appointed commander of the 99th Rifle Division. Under his leadership, the unit became one of the best in the district. Vlasov introduced new training methods, improved material and technical support, and increased the combat readiness of the units. The commander paid particular attention to political work. He understood that under Stalin's regime, military successes had to be accompanied by a demonstration of ideological reliability. Vlasov regularly gave reports on the international situation, conducted political briefings, and participated in party events. In 1939, Vlasov's division was transferred to the Far East, where it took part in battles against Japanese troops on the Khalkhin-Gol River. Although the main events unfolded in the area of operations of other units, Vlasov's units successfully completed their tasks, for which the commander was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. After the conflict, the division returned to the Kiev Military District. Vlasov continued to improve the combat training of his subordinates, introducing new tactical techniques and training methods. His experience was studied in other units, and the general himself was often involved in the development of regulations and instructions. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, Andrei Vlasov was one of the most promising generals of the Red Army, enjoyed the trust of the top leadership, and had a reputation as a talented military leader. On June 22, 1941, the war reached Vlasov's division. The 99th Rifle Division was stationed near the state border and was one of the first to take the brunt of the German attack. From the very first hours of the war, the general demonstrated the qualities that would make his name known throughout the country. The German offensive developed with hurricane force. The enemy's tank wedges broke through the defenses, surrounded and destroyed entire Red Army units. In these conditions, many commanders lost control of their troops, and units scattered, leaving behind equipment and weapons. Vlasov acted differently. He managed to organize a systematic retreat of the division, avoiding encirclement and preserving the bulk of his personnel. Moreover, his units repeatedly launched counterattacks, inflicting significant losses on the enemy. German documents from that period note the stubborn resistance of the 99th Division. In July 1941, Vlasov's division participated in the defense of Kiev. The general skillfully used city blocks to organize the defense, creating a system of strong points and firing points. His subordinates fought with exceptional courage, repelling numerous enemy attacks. The division distinguished itself particularly in the defense of the Lukyanovsky Bridge across the Dnieper. The Germans tried several times to capture this important crossing, but each time they were repelled by Vlasov's riflemen. The commander himself personally directed the battle, repeatedly appearing in the most dangerous areas. In August, the division was withdrawn from the battle and transferred to Smolensk, where it also distinguished itself in defensive battles. Vlasov demonstrated his ability to quickly assess the situation, make unconventional decisions, and effectively command troops in difficult conditions. The High Command took notice of the talented general. In September 1941, Vlasov was appointed commander of the 41st Mechanized Corps, part of the Southwestern Front. The new appointment was evidence of the growing confidence in the young commander. However, Vlasov achieved true fame in November 1941, when German troops approached Moscow. His corps was transferred to the Western Front and incorporated into General Vlasov's 20th Army. It was here that the future traitor's talent as a commander was fully revealed. Vlasov took command of the army under extremely difficult conditions. The Germans were 30 kilometers from the Kremlin, and the capital was preparing for street fighting. Many government agencies had been evacuated, and panic reigned among the population. In this situation, the general managed to organize an effective defense. The 20th Army took up defensive positions northwest of Moscow, covering the Volokholamsk and Istra directions. Vlasov personally visited all sections, determined key positions, and deployed troops. He demanded that commanders engage in active defense, constant counterattacks, and exhaust the enemy. The defense was organized in a new way. Instead of a continuous line of trenches, Vlasov created a system of strong points linked by fire and maneuver. This tactic allowed for maximum use of available forces, giving the enemy the impression of large reserves. In December, the Soviet counteroffensive began near Moscow. Vlasov's 20th Army played a key role in it, advancing in the Solnechnogorsk direction. The general managed not only to stop the enemy, but also to push them back a considerable distance from the capital. After his success near Moscow, Vlasov's name became known throughout the country. His portraits appeared in newspapers, and military correspondents wrote about the exploits of the 20th Army. Stalin was personally aware of the general's merits and planned to use his talent in new operations. In January 1942, Vlasov was appointed deputy commander of the Volkhov Front and simultaneously commander of the Second Shock Army. This appointment was supposed to be a new step in the career of the talented military leader. However, fate decided otherwise. The Volkhov Front was created to break the blockade of Leningrad. The troops were tasked with breaking through the German defenses, joining forces with the city's defenders, and lifting the siege of the northern capital. The operation was planned as a swift strike that was to end in complete victory. Vlasov took command in a difficult situation. The Second Shock Army had been fighting heavy battles for several months in the swampy terrain between the Volkhov and Chudovishche rivers. The troops suffered heavy losses and were short of ammunition and food. The terrain where the army was operating consisted of continuous swamps and forests, crisscrossed by a few roads. The Germans had created a powerful defense system here using natural obstacles. Every hill, every village had been turned into a fortified resistance center. Despite the difficulties, Vlasov attempted to accomplish the task at hand. He reorganized the command of the troops, improved the supply of units, and rotated the most exhausted units. Under his leadership, the army resumed offensive operations. Initially, the offensive was successful. Soviet troops broke through the first line of German defenses, advanced 20 to 30 kilometers, and captured several settlements. It seemed that the objective of the operation would be achieved. However, the German command quickly responded to the threat. Reserves were transferred to the combat zone, the Air Force was reinforced, and new defensive lines were created. The Soviet offensive began to falter, and the troops suffered increasing losses. By May 1942, the situation had changed dramatically. The Germans launched a counteroffensive, striking the flanks of the Second Shock Army. The so-called Volkhov cauldron was formed. Vlasov's troops were surrounded. Attempts to break through the encirclement were unsuccessful. The German ring tightened. Soviet units lost contact with each other and broke up into separate groups. Supplies to the troops practically ceased, and starvation set in. Vlasov found himself in a desperate situation. His army was doomed to destruction, and there was no help to be expected. Front Commander Meretskov received orders from headquarters to break the Second Shock Army out of the encirclement at any cost, but he did not have the real forces to do so. In June, the situation became critical. The remnants of the army controlled only a small area of marshy terrain, surrounded by a tight ring of enemies. Ammunition was running out. There was nowhere to evacuate the wounded, and many units existed only nominally. On July 12, 1942, Vlasov made a decision that changed not only his personal fate, but also the course of the entire war. He removed his general's insignia, changed into civilian clothes, and attempted to break out of the encirclement with a small group. The attempt failed. On July 20th, a German patrol detained a group of suspicious individuals in a forest near the village of Tukovizh. Among those detained was the former commander of the Second Shock Army, Lieutenant General Andrei Andreevich Vlasov. The hero of the defense of Moscow became a prisoner. His capture was a turning point in General Vlasov's fate. From a hero of the defense of Moscow, he became a prisoner of war, whose future depended on the will of the enemy. It was in the prisoner of war camps that the spiritual transformation took place that led to the birth of the Vlasov movement. Initially, Vlasov was held in a prisoner of war camp in Vinnytsia. Conditions were harsh: meager food, unsanitary conditions, and a lack of medical care. Many prisoners died of starvation and disease. The Germans kept Soviet commanders separate, considering them the most dangerous. German officers quickly realized the value of the captured general. Vlasov was one of the highest-ranking Red Army commanders to be taken prisoner. His name was well known, and his authority among prisoners of war could be used for propaganda purposes. In the fall of 1942, they began to conduct educational work with Vlasov. He was assigned an interpreter, Captain Strickfeld, a Russian émigré who served in the German army. This man played a key role in the ideological processing of the captured general. Strickfeld was an educated man who knew Russian history and culture well. He managed to find an approach to Vlasov, appealing not to betrayal, but to the higher goals of the struggle against Bolshevism. The idea of the need to save the Russian people from Stalin's tyranny was a common thread in their conversations. Gradually, a change took place in Vlasov's mind. A man who had served the Soviet regime all his life began to doubt the correctness of the path he had chosen. The defeats of the Red Army, the cruelty of Stalin's regime, the deaths of millions of his compatriots, all this forced him to rethink his life. German propaganda skillfully exploited these sentiments. Vlasov was shown the atrocities of the NKVD, told about the repression of the peasantry, and shown letters from Soviet prisoners of war cursing the Stalinist regime. All this made a strong impression on the general. In the winter of 1942 to 1943, Vlasov made his final decision. He agreed to cooperate with the Germans in the fight against Soviet power. This decision was not easy for him. He understood that he was crossing a line from which there would be no turning back. On December 27, 1942, the so-called Smolensk Declaration was published, a document signed by Vlasov and other captured Soviet generals. The declaration proclaimed the goals of fighting against Bolshevism and creating a new Russia. The declaration became the first programmatic document of the Vlasov movement. It spoke of the need to overthrow Stalin's tyranny, build a just society, and liberate the peoples of Russia from the communist yoke. The document was written in the spirit of Russian patriotism, avoiding direct references to cooperation with Germany. The publication of the declaration had a great resonance among both prisoners of war and the occupied territories. Many saw it as an expression of their own thoughts and feelings. Vlasov's name became a symbol of anti-Soviet resistance. However, the German leadership treated Vlasov's initiative with great caution. Hitler and his entourage viewed Slavs as an inferior race, incapable of independent political creativity. The idea of creating a Russian liberation army contradicted the racial doctrine of Nazism. Nevertheless, military failures on the Eastern Front forced the Germans to look for new forms of struggle. The use of Soviet prisoners of war in anti-Soviet propaganda seemed a promising direction. Vlasov received permission to create the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia. Thus began a new chapter in the life of the former Soviet general. From a prisoner of war, he became a political figure who led the movement of Russian collaborators. The road to betrayal was traveled to the end. Creating the ideological basis for Vlasov's movement was one of the most difficult tasks facing the former Soviet general. It was necessary to formulate a program that would attract millions of Soviet citizens and at the same time not contradict the interests of the German leadership. Vlasov understood that simply rejecting Soviet power was not enough to create a mass movement. A positive program was needed that could inspire people to fight. The ideology was based on ideas about authentic Russia, distorted by the Bolshevik experiment. The central idea was the concept of the People's Revolution of 1917, which had allegedly been hijacked by the Bolsheviks. Vlasov's followers claimed that the February Revolution expressed the true aspirations of the Russian people for freedom, while the October Revolution was a conspiracy by a handful of fanatics. The program envisaged the creation of a new Russia without Bolsheviks and capitalists. It was an attempt to find a third way between communism and capitalism that would appeal to the broad masses. The principles of social justice were proclaimed, but without class struggle. Particular attention was paid to the national question. The Vlasov movement advocated the right of peoples to self-determination, criticizing Soviet national policy as a form of Russian chauvinism under communist slogans. This was intended to attract the non-Russian peoples of the USSR. Religion also played an important role in the ideology. Vlasov's followers proclaimed freedom of conscience, criticized the Bolsheviks' persecution of the church, and promised to restore religious life. For many believers, this was an important argument in favor of the movement. The economic program called for the abolition of collective farms and the return of land to the peasants. This was one of the most popular points, as collectivization left painful memories for millions of rural residents. Freedom of trade and private initiative were also promised. In foreign policy, The Vlasovites advocated the creation of a federal state of the peoples of Russia, which would become an equal partner of European countries. They emphasized Russia's belonging to European civilization and the need for integration with the West. Criticism of the Stalinist system became an important part of their ideology. The Vlasovites accused the Soviet government of genocide against its own people, pointing to the famine of the 1930s, mass repression, and forced labor. These accusations had a real basis. At the same time, the movement tried to distance itself from German National Socialism. The Vlasovites emphasized that they were fighting not for Germany's victory, but for the liberation of Russia. They criticized Nazi racial theory and the cruelty of the occupation regime. Program documents avoided direct references to anti-Semitism, although anti-Jewish motifs were present in propaganda materials. This was a concession to the German allies, which the movement's leadership considered a temporary necessity. The social base of the movement was to include all segments of the population dissatisfied with Soviet power. Particular hopes were pinned on the peasantry, the intelligentsia, the Cossacks, and national minorities. It was assumed that these groups would form the basis of the Liberation Army. The propaganda of Vlasov's movement actively used historical parallels. Vlasov was compared to Minin and Pozarsky, and his supporters to the militias who fought against foreign invaders. The Bolsheviks were portrayed as new Tatar Mongols who had enslaved Russia. The movement's ideologues understood the need to create an attractive image of the future. New Russia was presented as a prosperous country where justice, freedom, and brotherhood of peoples reigned supreme. This utopian project was intended to counter the Soviet utopia. Thus, the ideology of the Vlasov movement was a complex synthesis of various political currents, from populism to nationalism. Its creators tried to find a formula that would unite all opponents of the Stalinist regime under a single banner. Propaganda became the main weapon of the Vlasov movement in the struggle for the minds of Soviet citizens. The German command provided Vlasov with considerable resources to wage psychological warfare against the USSR. An entire industry of anti-Soviet propaganda was created. The center of propaganda activity was a school for propagandists in Dabendorf near Berlin. Here, personnel were trained to carry out ideological work among prisoners of war and the population of the occupied territories. The teachers were both German specialists and Russian émigrés. Vlasov personally participated in the work of the school, giving lectures to students. His appearance made a strong impression on the audience. The former Soviet general, a hero of the defense of Moscow, exposed the crimes of Bolshevism in his own words. The main focus of propaganda was to influence Soviet prisoners of war. Anti-fascist schools were set up in the camps, where Red Army prisoners were subjected to ideological indoctrination. The aim was to persuade them to cooperate with the Germans. A variety of methods were used. Material incentives were also used. Better food, warm clothing, and medical care for those who agreed to cooperate. Psychological pressure was also applied, showing letters from home, telling stories about the fates of prisoners' families. Special attention was paid to working with the command staff. Captured officers were persuaded that they could be of greater use to their people by fighting against Stalin's regime than by dying in the camps. Many succumbed to these persuasions. Print propaganda was carried out on a large scale. The newspapers Zarya, Dobrovolets, and Boevoy Put were published, along with numerous leaflets and brochures. Some publications had a circulation of hundreds of thousands of copies. The materials were distributed both in prisoner of war camps and in the occupied territories. The content of the propaganda materials was carefully thought out. Direct calls for treason or praise of Germany were avoided. The main emphasis was on criticizing the Soviet government, stories about the atrocities of the NKVD, and descriptions of the plight of the people in the USSR. Eyewitness accounts from refugees, defectors, and victims of repression were actively used. Their stories of hunger, repression, and forced labor made a strong impression on readers. Many recognized their own fate or that of their loved ones in these stories. Radio propaganda also played an important role. Broadcasts were conducted in various languages of the peoples of the USSR. Speeches by Vlasov and other leaders of the movement were aired. Letters from Soviet prisoners of war were read, and news from the liberated territories was broadcast. Particularly popular were programs in which Soviet citizens were called upon by their relatives who had gone over to the German side. These programs had a strong emotional impact, causing people to doubt the righteousness of the war. Propaganda was adapted to different social groups. For peasants, materials were prepared on land reform. For workers, on freedom of labor. And for the intelligentsia, on freedom of creativity. Each group received what concerned them most. The effectiveness of the propaganda varied. Among prisoners of war living in harsh conditions, it had some success. Tens of thousands of Soviet citizens agreed to cooperate with the Germans. However, in the occupied territories, the results were more modest. The cruelty of the German occupation regime undermined confidence in Vlasov's propaganda. People saw the real actions of the Germans and understood that the promises of a new Russia did not correspond to reality. This became the main problem for the propaganda machine. Nevertheless, Vlasov's propaganda left a noticeable mark on the history of the Great Patriotic War. It showed that even in the midst of a deadly struggle with the enemy, there were serious contradictions within Soviet society that could be exploited by the enemy. The creation of the Russian Liberation Army was the crowning achievement of the Vlasov movement. After 2 years of propaganda work, the German leadership finally decided to form real military units from Soviet citizens who agreed to cooperate with Germany. Initially, the Germans were very skeptical about the idea of creating a Russian army. Nazi racial theory did not allow for the idea that Slavs could be reliable allies. However, the deterioration of the situation on the Eastern Front forced a rethinking of these views. By the end of 1943, it was clear that Germany was losing the war. Defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Allied landings in Italy, and growing resistance in the occupied territories all required the mobilization of additional resources. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, became the main supporter of the creation of the ROA. He understood that without the involvement of the local population, Germany would not be able to hold the captured territories. In September 1944, Himmler met with Vlasov and gave permission to form an army. On November 14, 1944, the founding Congress of the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia was held in Prague. The Congress was attended by representatives of various anti-Soviet organizations, prisoners of war, and emigrants. Vlasov was elected chairman of the CONR. The Congress adopted the Prague Manifesto, the main programmatic document of the Vlasov movement. It proclaimed the goals of the struggle: the overthrow of Stalin's tyranny, the conclusion of an honorable peace with Germany, and the creation of a new, just Russia. The manifesto declared the equality of all peoples of Russia, freedom of conscience, the abolition of collective farms, and the restoration of trade and crafts. The document was drafted in the spirit of democratic principles. although the real possibilities for their implementation were highly questionable. After the creation of the KON, the formation of the Committee's armed forces began. The very Russian Liberation Army that Vlasov had dreamed of for so long. The 1st Division, commanded by Major General Sergei Bunyachenko, was formed in February 1945. The division consisted of about 17,000 men. They were prisoners of war who agreed to serve in the ROA, volunteers from among the Osterbiters, Cossacks, and representatives of national formations. Command positions were held by former Soviet officers. The division's weapons were mixed: German, captured Soviet, and Czech. The uniforms were also heterogeneous: German uniforms with Russian insignia, Soviet gymnastics shirts with German orders. This created a rather motley picture. The personnel were trained according to German regulations, but with Russian military traditions taken into account. Particular attention was paid to political training. Soldiers were convinced of the righteousness of the fight against Bolshevism and told about the goals of the movement. The 2nd Division of the ROA, under the command of Colonel Georgy Shilibatov, was formed in Neugammer. By March 1945, the Russian Liberation Army had grown to almost 50,000 troops. Vlasov was frankly weary of dependence on the Germans. He insisted on the complete political sovereignty of the KNR, on the right to independently determine the strategy for the combat use of troops, and on the creation of his own uniform without German symbols. The reality of the front quickly destroyed these plans. Soviet troops were rapidly advancing westward. The Allies had landed in Normandy, and the bombing of German cities had become a daily routine. Vlasov's army found itself without a reliable rear and a clear future. In January 1945, the 1st Division entered into battle against the Red Army on the Oder River. The losses were catastrophic. Poorly trained and poorly equipped soldiers could not withstand the onslaught of Rokossovsky's tank armadas. The attempt to use Vlasov's troops to suppress the Warsaw Uprising provoked open protest from the officers of the KONR. The idea of fighting against the Poles, who were also fighting against a totalitarian regime, was in direct contradiction to the declared goals of the movement. The German command was forced to withdraw the ROA from this direction and transfer it to the southern section of the front. By spring, the situation had become hopeless. The Germans had lost the strategic initiative, and Vlasov understood that if his troops did not defect to the Western Allies, they would face inevitable punishment by Soviet justice. In April, the KONR headquarters began secret negotiations with representatives of the American Army about the possibility of surrender and joint action against communism. However, time was against Vlasov's forces. The front was rolling towards Berlin, and the Allies were in no hurry to take responsibility for the Russian collaborators. On April 25th, the 1st Division of the ROA left the front and moved west, effectively deserting the German army. Thus began the last and most dramatic stage of the Vlasovites' journey, the search for salvation in a world where no one was waiting for them and no one believed their promises. Soldiers without a homeland. That is how the Vlasovites bitterly referred to themselves in letters to their families. The social composition of the Russian Liberation Army was extremely diverse. The core consisted of former Soviet prisoners of war, for whom serving under Vlasov meant a chance to survive and avoid starvation in the camps. Among them were many peasants from the central regions, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and representatives of the Caucasian peoples. Cossack units made up a significant portion of the army. The Don and Kuban Cossacks hoped to restore their pre-war autonomy and get rid of the collective farms. The ideologues of the corner actively exploited the Cossack image as a symbol of the struggle of the free people of the steppe against Bolshevik slavery. The Cossacks were promised amnesty for participating in the Civil War on the side of the whites and guarantees of land self-government. Vlasov's followers sought to attract the intelligentsia. Engineers, doctors, teachers. Positions were allocated for them in the Propaganda Abteilung, newspaper editorial offices, and radio stations. Their task was to give the movement an intellectual gloss and formulate its ideology at a high cultural level. However, most Soviet specialists preferred to wait out the war, not wanting to break ties with their homeland for good. The motives for joining the ROA varied. The desire to survive, hatred of the Stalinist regime, hope for a quick German victory, personal revenge for repression. There were also many staunch anti-communists who sincerely believed in the possibility of building a new Russia under German patronage. But what they all had in common was a feeling of homelessness. Returning home meant execution, staying with the Germans meant defeat, and going to the Allies meant an uncertain future. Discipline in the divisions was maintained through a mixture of ideological indoctrination and harsh measures. Desertion was punishable by execution, and collaboration with partisans by public execution. The Germans demanded complete loyalty from the ROA command, but they themselves treated Russian soldiers with contempt, often delaying the delivery of uniforms and rations. A particular test of morale for Vlasov's men were combat encounters with their former comrades from the Red Army. Propaganda claimed that they were waging a brotherly war for liberation. But in practice, the Eastern Front turned into a fratricidal meat grinder. Red Army prisoners captured by the ROA often defected to them out of fear of the camps. But there were also cases when Vlasov's troops released their compatriots. An ideological rift was brewing at the heart of the movement. Radicals led by Konstantin Kromiady insisted on a strong alliance with the Wehrmacht, considering Hitler the only force capable of defeating Stalin. The moderates, grouped around Ivan Mikhailov, dreamed of coming under the protection of Western democracies. Vlasov balanced between these two poles, losing the trust of both sides. By the spring of 1945, it had become clear that the social experiment known as the Russian Liberation Army had become a hostage to a foreign war and a foreign ideology. Soldiers without a homeland were preparing for a last-ditch effort, an escape from a history that had left them no place. The first and only major battle of the ROA took place at the end of March 1945 on the Oder front. Bunyachenko's division received orders from the Germans to delay the advance of the First Belarusian Front in the area of Frankfurt an der Oder. The operation was purely tactical in nature, but for Vlasov's men, it was a test of their combat capability. For 2 days, the ROA infantry held their defenses on the right bank of the Merten River. Field fortifications erected by sappers helped repel the first attacks. The artillery, mostly captured from the Soviets, fired under the guidance of artillery officers who had recently served in the Red Army. Nevertheless, the superiority of the enemy forces was overwhelming. 3 Soviet tank corps, supported by Guards mortar brigades, swept away the Vlasovites' defenses by noon on March 28th. Casualties amounted to about 5,000 killed and missing. The Germans accused the ROA of cowardice, threatening to disband it. But even their own soldiers were shocked. They saw how illusory the hopes for an equal union with the Third Reich were. After the failure on the Oder, Vlasov gave the order to avoid frontline clashes, focusing on moving south to Bohemia. The next episode was Operation Stone Wall. an attempt by Vlasov's forces, together with Czech partisans, to block the retreat of German troops through the Sudetenland. In early April, small ROA units captured several bridges across the Vltava River and destroyed railroad switches, paralyzing the movement of trains. These actions angered the German command and at the same time attracted the attention of the Allies. However, the main battle that went down in history textbooks was the participation of the 1st ROA Division in the Prague Uprising. On May 5th, the Czech National Council appealed to Vlasov for help. Without consulting the Germans, Bunyachenko led the Vlasovites into battle on the streets of Prague. In 2 days, they captured several key buildings, including a radio station, and repelled counterattacks by the SS. Prague rejoiced, but the political calculation proved ruthless. The Soviet command demanded that Eisenhower hand over the traitors to the motherland. The American headquarters strongly recommended that the Vlasovites leave the city and head west, so as not to complicate relations within the anti-Hitler coalition. On the night of May 8th, the division secretly left Prague and headed for the Mozhe River, where American troops were stationed. The ROA's military operations ended as quickly as they had begun, with minor victories in the streets of the Czech capital and a final flight from everyone, from their former German allies, from their Soviet pursuers, and from their own illusory idea. The Prague Uprising was the culmination of a paradox. An army created by Hitler helped liberate a European capital from the Nazis. Czech historians still argue whether Vlasov's troops played a decisive role in saving the city or merely used the uprising for their own evacuation. On May 5th, the rebels seized Prague radio and appealed to all Russian comrades in the vicinity. Bunyachenko reacted immediately. He saw a chance to score political points with the Allies. 2 brigades of the 1st Division entered the city through Žižkov and Vyšehrad. The soldiers' Soviet uniforms were adorned with improvised white-blue-red armbands to distinguish them from the Wehrmacht. Street fighting broke out in the center of Prague with SS garrisons. ROA machine gun crews occupied the attics of buildings, turning narrow streets into corridors of fire. Local residents supplied the Russian fighters with food and medicine, seeing them as long-awaited reinforcements. By the evening of May 6th, Vlasov's troops had driven the SS out of the Old Town, captured the police headquarters, and freed the Jews from Pankrak prison. However, by May 7th, the situation had changed. Soviet tank columns were approaching Prague, while American troops were stationed 80 kilometers to the west and had no intention of advancing beyond the agreed line. The Czech leadership feared that the presence of traitors would provoke a bloody crackdown by the Red Army on the capital. At an emergency meeting of the KONR, Vlasov made the bitter decision to withdraw his troops. Czech partisans begged him to stay, but politics prevailed. On the night of May 8th, the ROA columns left the city through the southern suburbs, leaving Prague at the mercy of the coming liberators. The evacuation was chaotic. The roads were clogged with retreating German units, refugees, and supply trains. Vlasov's troops lost contact, units disintegrated, and many threw down their weapons and tried to hide among civilians. By the morning of May 12th, about 6,000 soldiers had managed to cross the Mozhe River and surrender to Patton's army units. The Americans disarmed the Vlasovites and placed them in makeshift camps, but were soon forced to comply with the terms of the Yalta agreements. Soviet repatriation missions were allowed to search the camps. People who had fought against Stalin under anti-communist slogans now found themselves in the hands of the NKVD. The road to the Lubyanka dungeons began in the peaceful meadows of Bavaria. After Germany's surrender, the Vlasov movement ceased to exist as a military force, but fought for survival in the legal arena. KONR officers hoped to use their status as prisoners of war of the Western Allies to avoid extradition to the USSR. They had the anti-communist sentiments of some American military personnel and the beginning confrontation between former allies on their side. Nevertheless, diplomatic obligations proved stronger. According to the decisions of the Crimean Conference, all citizens of the USSR who found themselves in the zone of Allied control were subject to repatriation. Exceptions were made only for persons who could prove foreign citizenship prior to 1939. For Vlasov's followers, this meant a death sentence. On May 13th, Smersh agents arrested Vlasov in the Bavarian town of Landshut. The general, dressed in civilian clothes, hoped to hide in a monastery, but was recognized by Soviet officers. He was taken to the airport in Pilsen and flown to Moscow on a special flight. Bunyachenko, Strickfeldt, Maltsev, and about 300 other senior ROA officers. The investigation lasted 8 months. A special task force headed by General Abakumov worked at the Lubyanka. The indictment contained 42 counts, ranging from armed rebellion to collaboration with Hitler's punitive organs. Vlasov remained calm, emphasizing the political nature of his actions during interrogations and denying participation in punitive actions. Many officers, under pressure from the investigation, gave confessions in the hope of mitigating their fate. However, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. The first trial in the KONR case was held in closed session from July 25th to August 1st, 1946. The judges of the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR sentenced Vlasov and 11 of his closest associates to death by hanging. At dawn on August 1st, the prisoners were taken to the courtyard of the Lefortovo prison. According to the guards' recollections, the general asked permission to address his comrades, but the convoy refused. The sentence was carried out without publicity. Only a short TASS report on the liquidation of the gang of traitors to the motherland appeared in the official newspapers. Hundreds of officers and thousands of ordinary ROA soldiers received sentences of 10 to 20 years in camps, and many of them were listed as missing for a long time. The repression also affected their families. Wives and children were deprived of their civil rights and sent to the northern regions. Thus ended the last act of the tragedy of an army without a state. The historical judgment of Vlasov's followers continued far beyond the courtroom. In post-war USSR, their names became a symbol of betrayal. Textbooks and newspaper articles painted a black and white picture. A hero traitor who defected to the enemy at the most difficult moment. However, an alternative interpretation began to emerge among émigrés. Russian magazines in Munich and New York published the memoirs of ROA officers who justified their actions as a struggle against totalitarianism. In the late 1950s, Wilhelm von Schoenbeck's book, Army Without a Fatherland, was published in West Germany, in which Vlasov was presented as a Russian de Gaulle who tried to liberate the country from dictatorship. In the USSR, any attempts to rehabilitate Vlasov's followers were punishable by law. In 1966, a schoolteacher in Krasnodar was arrested for telling high school students about the ROA's battles near Prague. He was sentenced to 7 years in a labor camp for anti-Soviet propaganda. The topic remained taboo until the end of the 1980s. The turning point came during the years of perestroika. In 1988, the magazine Nový Mir published Viktor Nekrasov's story In the Trenches of Prague, which mentioned Vlasovites for the first time without the usual derogatory epithets. The article caused a storm of indignation among veterans, but interest in the topic grew exponentially. After the collapse of the USSR, a new wave of rethinking began. A number of national liberal publicists and politicians tried to portray Vlasov as almost the first fighter for democratic reforms. Some organizations demanded the rehabilitation of the ROA as an anti-communist resistance. In response, in 1998, the State Duma adopted a statement confirming the status of Vlasovites as war criminals. Historians were divided into several camps. The first school, the statist school, emphasized the legal aspect. Collaboration with the enemy automatically means treason. The second, the revisionist school, recognized personal guilt, but called for consideration of the context of Stalin's repressions and the monstrous camp conditions that pushed people to collaboration. The third, postmodernist school, viewed the Vlasov phenomenon as a tragedy of choice in an extreme situation, seeking to avoid moralizing. Scientific discussions also touched on the international aspect. Western researchers saw the ROA as an example of intra-imperial resistance in the Third Reich. Comparisons with the Ukrainian insurgent army, the Croatian Home Guard, and the French milice helped to understand why some of the conquered peoples chose to ally themselves with Hitler. At the beginning of the new millennium, the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation twice considered requests for the posthumous rehabilitation of Vlasov and rejected them due to the particularly serious nature of the crimes. At the same time, pages presenting the ROA as an unrecognized Russian freedom movement were gaining popularity on social media. The debate continued, turning from a historical one into a political one. The legacy of Vlasovism left a deep mark on the fates of thousands of people. Former ROA soldiers, handed over to the USSR, were sent to special camps. After the amnesty of 1956, few managed to return to peaceful life. Most hid their past, fearing dismissal and persecution. Their grandchildren learned the truth by accident, from forgotten medals for the Eastern Campaign or old photographs. In exile, former Vlasovites created the Brotherhood of Memory Association, headquartered in Liechtenstein. They collected documents, published the Dobrovolets, volunteer newsletter, and supported the families of those who had been repressed. But with the passing of the first generation, the movement lost momentum. Young people preferred to integrate into Western society. In their homeland, Vlasovites were remembered every year on May 8th as traitors. In military schools, cadets were given lectures on the lessons of treason, during which footage of Bunyachenko's hanging was shown and the tribunal's verdicts were quoted. The official narrative cemented the image of the enemy within the nation. At the same time, a professional memory was gradually taking shape. In the 1990s, the Russian Military Historical Society included in its expedition plans a search for the graves of ROA soldiers in the Czech Republic and Germany. Searching historians, without sharing political sympathies, set themselves the task of restoring the names of the dead and returning the remains to their relatives. In the Czech Republic, the situation proved to be more complicated. On the one hand, the Vlasovites were thanked for their help in the uprising. On the other hand, the participation of some ROA battalions in punitive operations in Ukraine and Belarus could not be forgotten. In Prague, A memorial stone to the Bunyachenko division was erected only in 2011 and immediately splashed with red paint. In Russia, attempts to erect memorial plaques to the general were met with mass protests. In 2012, the administration of the Novodevichy Cemetery refused to allow an initiative group to erect a symbolic cenotaph to Vlasov. The city council explained its decision as incompatible with the historical values of the fatherland. The public divide became even deeper. However, paradoxically, it was precisely the phenomenon of the Vlasovites that forced society to talk more widely about the crimes of Stalinism and the moral choices individuals face in the face of totalitarianism. University courses on modern history now include lectures in which the Vlasov question serves as a case study for discussing collaboration, political loyalty, and human rights in wartime. Today, 80 years later, the question, are heroes traitors or traitors heroes, remains unanswered. The Vlasovites have become a kind of mirror of society. Each era sees in them a reflection of its own fears and hopes. For veterans of the Great Patriotic War, they will forever remain traitors who betrayed their oath in the face of the enemy. Their position is reinforced by personal experience of bloodshed and loss. For the descendants of those who were repressed, Vlasov is a symbol of rebellion against Stalinist terror, an attempt to escape from the totalitarian nightmare at any cost. Historical science increasingly speaks of the need for a multi-layered assessment. The facts show that the ROA participated in both combat operations against the Wehrmacht and punitive actions in the occupied territories. It saved Prague and at the same time guarded the Osterbeiter camps. Paradox became the essence of their existence. The moral choice made by Andrei Vlasov took place in conditions where the boundaries between good and evil were blurred by the horrific reality of totalitarian regimes. Some see him as a pragmatic careerist, others as a desperate patriot seeking a third way. But both agree. His move split the national memory. The modern Russian Federation, while condemning the Vlasovites at the official level, at the same time allows them to be discussed in academic and public circles. This is evidence of the maturing of historical consciousness, from the prohibition of memory to its complex acceptance with all its contradictions. Can society come to terms with a past where heroism and betrayal coexist? The answer depends on the willingness to acknowledge the tragedy of choice without excuses, but also without demonization. Vlasov's followers will forever remain a reminder of the fragility of oaths, the price of political utopias, and how easily patriotism can become a weapon of ideology. Their story is both a warning and a lesson. Ideals without freedom take the form of poisonous faith, and freedom without a moral core turns into a new form of slavery. To understand this, one need only look at the fate of the general who raised the banner twice, and both times led his people to their doom.